"I've come to apologize," Daniels said, his voice filled with sincerity. "What I said earlier was wrong. I didn't understand. I didn't know what your father meant to you or what he did for this country. I was a fool." Jimmy Thompson sat quietly in the waiting room of the Westfield Police Department in Indiana. His small hands gripped his father's dog tag tightly, as if it was the only thing left of him. His gaze was fixed on his mother, Susan, who was speaking with the officer at the front desk. Despite the bustling noises around him, Jimmy felt an overwhelming sense of solitude. His heart ached knowing that his father, a soldier who had given his life for his country, would never return. Around him, people chuckled softly, casting curious glances at the young boy sitting alone. Officer Mark Daniels, a stocky man with a thick mustache, approached the boy, eyeing the dog tag in his hands. "Your dad was some kind of war hero." "Huh, sure, kid," he said with a smirk, his tone dripping with mockery. Jimmy said nothing. He simply tightened his grip on the dog tag, his eyes looking down at it as if it were a piece of his heart he could never let go. The whispers of the others faded into the background, but the hurt in his chest remained. No one around him understood. No one knew the pain of losing a father, especially not to a war that had taken him too soon. "Kid, every guy with boots and a buzz cut says that." Officer Daniels continued exchanging a knowing glance with a clerk at the desk. "You probably saw that in a movie or something. Heroes are just stories. Your dad wasn't anything special." He laughed as the desk clerk shook his head silently, sharing in the moment of mockery. Still, Jimmy remained silent, holding the dog tag even tighter, his knuckles whitening. His mother, Susan, could hear the conversation, and her face flushed with both anger and embarrassment. She turned from the desk, walking over to her son. "Come on, sweetie, let's sit down," she said, her voice steady, though the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. Jimmy followed her to a bench, not saying a word. The dog tag, still clutched in his small hand, felt heavier than ever. The silence between them was thick, but it was a silence that spoke volumes of love loss and the unspoken bond they shared. Officer Daniels went back to his paperwork, occasionally glancing at the boy. The silence between them was uncomfortable, and yet Daniels felt a strange tension in the air that he couldn't quite explain. As Jimmy and Susan sat down, Daniels' eyes lingered on them for a moment before he turned his attention back to his work. But just as the tension in the room seemed to settle, the door to the department swung open with force. A tall man wearing a full military uniform, adorned with ribbons and medals, walked into the room. His presence was commanding, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. Everyone's gaze shifted toward him as he moved. Not to the desk, not to the officers, but straight to Jimmy. The room was silent as the tall figure in military uniform entered the police station. Colonel Robert Harris, his chest adorned with ribbons and medals, stepped with purpose, his boots echoing on the cold floor. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath as he walked past officers and civilians, his gaze fixed solely on Jimmy. Jimmy, still sitting with his mother on the bench, looked up in surprise. He had never expected anyone like this to come into the station, especially not someone who looked so important. The colonel's stern expression softened when his eyes met Jimmy's. He approached the boy without hesitation, his stride purposeful, and stopped just 3 feet in front of him. The tension in the room hung thick, but Colonel Harris remained unmoved. He stood tall, his hand snapping to his brow in a perfect military salute. The action was not just for formality, it was a tribute, a deep sign of respect. "Young man," the colonel said, his voice strong and clear, "Sergeant Major Benjamin Thompson was my instructor, my commander and my hero." Susan's eyes widened as she stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She recognized the name immediately, her husband's old title, the man who had taught so many, including this colonel. The room fell even quieter, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Officer Daniels, who had just moments ago mocked Jimmy, froze at his desk, his pen hovering over a half-finished report. Jimmy, in contrast to the stiff, formal behavior of the officer, simply sat there, his small hand still clutching his father's dog tag. It felt heavier now, almost as if the weight of his father's memory was being transferred to him in that very moment. Slowly, hesitantly, Jimmy stood up, his legs trembling slightly, but his posture straight. Colonel Harris smiled gently, seeing the boy's respect for his father, and extended his hand to Jimmy. "Your father saved my life, son," he said, his voice softer now, but still filled with undeniable authority. "And the men he trained, men like me, we owe him more than words can express." The room was filled with an unspoken reverence. Officer Daniels, for the first time, was unable to speak, his face a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. The entire department had been silent, waiting for something to break the stillness. And yet it wasn't until that moment that they began to truly grasp who Sergeant Major Benjamin Thompson was, and what he had done not only for his country, but for the lives of those who had served beside him. "Your father," Colonel Harris continued, "was not just a soldier. He was a leader, a man who would refuse to leave anyone behind. Even when it cost him his life, he made sure others were safe." Susan, her hand on Jimmy's shoulder, blinked back tears. She had never heard anyone speak of her husband with such admiration, and it struck her deeply. She had always known Benjamin was a hero, but hearing it from someone who had fought beside him in battle made the loss feel even more real. Yet there was something else, a sense of pride, knowing her husband's legacy was being carried on in stories like this. Jimmy didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said everything. He wasn't just hearing the words, he was internalizing them. His father had been a true hero, and now others saw it too. Officer Daniels, still seated at his desk, shifted uncomfortably. He couldn't deny it any longer. His earlier mocking of Jimmy and the boy's father now felt hollow, like a cruel joke he had made at the expense of something much greater than himself. As Colonel Harris finished his story, he turned to Daniels, his eyes narrowing. "You may not have known him, officer," he said, "but now you know what kind of man he was, and you should know that some people are deserving of more respect than we often give them." He didn't need to say more. The message had been delivered. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Daniels was about to speak, but before he could, Colonel Harris turned back to Jimmy. "I hope you'll remember this, young man," he said quietly, "not just for your father's sake, but for your own." "Officer." Mark Daniels couldn't shake the weight of Colonel Harris's words. As the day passed, he found himself lost in thought, replaying the moments in the police station over and over again. He could still see the look in Jimmy's eyes, the unwavering loyalty in the boy's gaze, and the quiet pride he held for a father he would never fully know. The room had been so silent, so still, as the colonel had honored the memory of Sergeant Major Benjamin Thompson. Daniels had heard those stories of heroism before on the news and books, but never had he felt the impact so personally. Never had he realized just how real and present those sacrifices were, how they lived on through the families left behind. Sitting at his desk, Daniels absent-mindedly shuffled through paperwork, his mind drifting back to the moments when he had mocked Jimmy and his father. The laughter in the room, the snide remarks about the hero that wasn't really a hero, all seemed so distant now. The mocking words felt foreign on his tongue, almost like they belonged to someone else, a version of himself he didn't even recognize anymore. He had always thought of himself as tough as a man who could see through the bravado of others, but now he saw how little he had understood about the depth of sacrifice, how foolish he had been to belittle the boy's pain. Captain John Reynolds walked past Daniel's desk, his eyes lingering for a moment longer than usual. He had noticed the shift in Daniels since the encounter with Colonel Harris. He had seen the officer's earlier bravado crumble and the guilt that had taken its place. He wasn't sure if Daniels was ready to face the full consequences of his actions, but he knew it was time for a conversation. "Mark," Captain Reynolds said quietly, placing a hand on the back of Daniel's chair, "you've been here a long time. You've seen your fair share of tough situations, but there's something different about this one, isn't there?" Daniels didn't meet his gaze, his hands clenched around the pen in his hand. He had tried to push the guilt away, but it wouldn't leave. He nodded, a lump rising in his throat. "I made a mistake," he muttered. "I didn't know, I didn't understand." Reynolds pulled up a chair sitting across from him. "It's not too late to make it right, Mark. You've been a good officer, but you can't ignore the fact that some things, some people deserve more respect than we give them. Colonel Harris showed you that today. He showed us all." Daniels looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "How do I fix it? How do I make up for what I said to that kid? He was looking at me like I was some kind of monster." "By showing him that you've changed," Reynolds said, his voice steady but firm. "It's going to take time, but actions speak louder than words. Go to him, apologize. Don't expect him to forgive you right away. He's been hurt, and that takes time to heal." Daniels sat in silence, the weight of the words settling on his shoulders. He knew that making things right wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only thing that mattered now. The boy Jimmy deserved more than an apology. He deserved respect, and he deserved to know that his father's sacrifice was not in vain. The cold evening air wrapped around Officer Mark Daniels as he stepped out of the police station. His hands felt clammy, despite the chill, his heart racing with every step he took toward his car. He hadn't planned on leaving so quickly, but the conversation with Captain Reynolds had been the tipping point. There was no more time to wait, no more time to make excuses. He needed to make it right, to apologize to Jimmy, and to face the consequences of his actions. As Daniels drove through the quiet streets of Westfield, he couldn't help but replay the events from earlier in the day. He remembered the look on Jimmy's face when he mocked him, the shame that washed over him as Colonel Harris stood in front of the boy saluting him. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of how wrong he had been. It wasn't just about the boy, it was about the respect he had failed to give to a man who had served his country, who had given everything for others. Jimmy's father, Sergeant Major Benjamin Thompson, wasn't just a hero in the battlefield. He was a hero in every sense of the word, and Daniels had belittled that. Now, as he drove through the winding streets, Daniels knew that the only way to move forward was to face the boy and his mother. He needed to show them that he had changed, that he understood the weight of what he had done. He parked in front of a small house on the outskirts of town, a modest place that stood as a symbol of the quiet strength of the family inside. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow on the steps, and for a moment Daniels hesitated. He didn't know what to expect. Would Jimmy speak to him? Would Susan listen to his apology? He wasn't sure, but he knew he had to try. Taking a deep breath, Daniels walked up to the door and knocked. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited, unsure of what would come next. The sound of footsteps approached, and the door slowly creaked open. Susan stood there, her expression guarded, but not unkind. "Officer Daniels," she said quietly, her voice calm, though there was a hint of something more beneath it. "What brings you here?" "I need to talk," Daniels said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "About earlier today, about what I said to Jimmy." Susan's eyes softened slightly, though she still kept her distance. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "Jimmy's in his room. You're not going to find an easy answer here, but you're welcome to try." Daniels stepped inside the warmth of the house, a stark contrast to the chill he had just left outside. The simple furnishings, the soft lighting, everything about the home spoke of a quiet dignity, a dignity that Jimmy's father had fought to protect. He felt a pang of guilt as he walked into the living room, his eyes falling on a photo of Sergeant Major Benjamin Thompson, framed and displayed on the mantelpiece. The man in the photo looked strong, proud, and yet he was gone. Daniels couldn't escape the weight of that. Jimmy appeared from his room, his small figure standing in the doorway. The dog tag still hung around his neck, a silent reminder of the father he would never meet. His eyes locked onto Daniels, and for a moment the two of them stood there in silence, the tension thick between them. "I've come to apologize," Daniels said, his voice filled with sincerity. "What I said earlier was wrong. I didn't understand. I didn't know what your father meant to you or what he did for this country. I was a fool." Jimmy didn't respond immediately. He didn't even nod, but the look in his eyes softened just a little. Daniels could see that the boy was listening, that there was a crack in the wall of silence he had built around himself. "I know it's hard to forgive someone like me," Daniels continued, his voice steady but heavy with regret, "but I want you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Your father was a hero, and he should have been treated with the respect he deserved." Susan watched silently, her gaze never leaving Daniels. She had heard the apology, but she wasn't sure if she believed it. Not yet, but there was something different in his tone, something that told her this wasn't just an empty gesture. "Jimmy," Daniels said softly, turning his attention back to the boy, "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I need you to know that I respect your father and I respect you." Jimmy's expression remained unreadable for a moment, but then slowly he walked toward Daniels. He didn't offer an immediate forgiveness, but his actions spoke volumes. He stood before the officer, still gripping the dog tag, and for the first time since the encounter in the station, he looked up at Daniels and nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was a start. The days following his visit to Jimmy's home weighed heavily on Officer Mark Daniels. He couldn't escape the thought of Jimmy's small nod, the softening in his eyes, and the unspoken forgiveness that hung in the air. It wasn't a clean slate, not by any means. The boy's silent response was far from an acceptance of his apology, but Daniels knew that it was a step forward. That's all he could ask for, a chance to prove that he could change, to show that the respect he had failed to offer was now being earned. Back at the police station, Daniels threw himself into his work, but the old rhythm wasn't there anymore. He found it harder to focus harder, to ignore the guilty thoughts that nagged at him. Each time he passed the desk where Jimmy had sat, each time he saw the photo of Sergeant Major Benjamin Thompson still hanging in the hallway, a sharp pang of regret hit him. The words of Colonel Harris rang in his mind, reminding him of what real heroes looked like and how those heroes had been left behind. One morning, Captain John Reynolds called him into his office. Mark Reynolds said, looking at him with a solemn expression, "You've been distant lately. I need to know where your head is at." Daniels hesitated, then sat down slowly. He could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he admitted. "About Jimmy, about his father." His voice trailed off as he remembered the look on the boy's face, the pain that had been masked by silence. "You made a mistake," Reynolds said, his tone firm but understanding. "But you've taken the first step in fixing it, going to Jimmy, apologizing to him. That was the right move. But now it's time for you to do more. This isn't something you can fix with just words." Daniels nodded slowly, the weight of the captain's words sinking in. "I know, but I'm not sure what more I can do." Reynolds looked at him thoughtfully for a moment before speaking again. "You've been here long enough to know that actions speak louder than words. You're going to have to show Jimmy and everyone else that you mean what you say. Respect isn't something that comes easy. It has to be earned, and that means proving it day after day." The captain's words hit Daniels harder than he expected. He had been so caught up in his own guilt that he had overlooked the deeper truth. It wasn't just about apologizing. It was about demonstrating the kind of change that would make Jimmy and his mother believe that he was worthy of their respect. "I'll do whatever it takes," Daniels said quietly. "I don't want to let this go. I don't want Jimmy to think his father's sacrifice was for nothing." Reynolds nodded, a faint smile appearing. "Good. You've got a long way to go, but you're on the right path. Just remember, showing respect isn't just about saying the right things. It's about how you act when no one's watching." Later that day, Daniels took the first step in what would be a long journey toward making things right. He requested time off and went to the local Veterans Affairs office to speak with people who had worked closely with veterans like Sergeant Major Thompson. He needed to learn more, not just about his mistake, but about what it truly meant to honor a fallen hero. As Daniels listened to stories of soldiers who had served with Thompson, a clearer picture began to form in his mind. He learned about the sacrifice, the quiet courage, and the camaraderie that bound these men together. He realized that while he had mocked Jimmy's story, the boy's father was more than just a soldier. He was a man whose integrity and strength had shaped others in ways Daniels had never fully understood. The air was cooler than usual when Officer Mark Daniels stood outside the Thompson household the following afternoon. He hadn't felt such a mix of emotions in a long time: nervousness, determination, and a deep sense of responsibility. As he approached the front door, he noticed the small details that had eluded him before: the flower boxes under the windows, The neat porch steps, the faint smell of pine in the air. It all spoke of the family's quiet strength and resilience. He had come to realize that this wasn't just a house, it was a home, built on memories of a man who had given everything. Daniels hesitated for a moment, then rang the doorbell. His heart beat in his chest as he waited, unsure of what to expect. Would they let him in? Would they see the sincerity in his eyes, or would his apology still feel hollow to them? Before he could second-guess himself, the door opened, and there stood Susan Thompson. Her expression was cautious but not unkind. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice steady, but laced with an undertone of guarded curiosity. "What brings you back?" "I need to speak with you and Jimmy again." Daniels replied, his voice a little shakier than he'd intended. "I don't expect this to be easy, but I owe it to both of you to make things right. I was wrong, and I've spent the last few days realizing just how much—" Susan looked at him for a long moment before stepping aside to let him in. "Come in," she said softly. "I think we need to talk." As Daniels stepped into the house, he was struck by the quiet warmth of the place. The living room was cozy with soft lighting and family photos on the walls. There, amidst the photographs, was a framed picture of Sergeant Major Benjamin Thompson, Jimmy's father, the hero, the man whose sacrifice had been brushed aside by Daniels just days before. Jimmy was sitting at the kitchen table, the dog tag still hanging around his neck. His eyes met Daniels as he walked in, but the boy said nothing. There was no animosity in his gaze, just a quiet intensity, as if he were waiting for Daniels to prove he was worth the respect he had been given that day. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Daniels began, his voice sincere. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I was wrong. What I said, what I did, was out of ignorance. I didn't understand what your father gave to this country or to the people who served with him." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Jimmy didn't speak, but his grip on the dog tag tightened. Daniels continued, his voice growing steadier. "I've spent the last few days learning about your father, Jimmy. I've spoken to people who served with him, and I've listened to their stories. I've seen the kind of man he was, the kind of man I should have respected from the start. And I see that same strength in you. You're your father's son, and that's something no one can ever take away from you." Susan watched silently, her expression unreadable. She had heard the apology, but there was a part of her that still held back. Still unsure if it was enough, Daniels knew that the road to redemption wasn't just about saying the right words. It was about proving he had changed. "I can't undo the past," Daniels continued, "but I want to make sure you both know that your father's legacy will be honored. I've already started working on a memorial for him at the station, and I'm going to make sure that the men and women who work with me understand the kind of sacrifice he made. Your father deserves that. Jimmy, he deserves our respect, and you do too." Jimmy stood up slowly, still holding the dog tag. He walked over to Daniels, his small steps measured, and for a moment the room was completely still. Daniels held his breath, unsure of what was about to happen. Would Jimmy speak? Would he walk away? Then, without a word, Jimmy reached out and handed the dog tag to Daniels. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. It was a sign of trust, a sign that the walls had started to come down. Susan, who had been watching the exchange, finally spoke. "You've made a start, Mark," she said quietly, "but this is just the beginning. It's going to take time, but you've got our attention." Daniels nodded, a feeling of relief washing over him. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step forward. He had done the hardest thing, admitting his mistake, and now he had to prove he could live up to the promise he had made. As Daniels turned to leave, Susan stopped him at the door. "We'll see where this goes," she said, her voice firm, "but you need to understand something. Jimmy's father gave everything for people like you. Don't forget that. Thank you for joining us in this heartfelt journey through the story of Officer Mark Daniels and the Thompson family. The road to redemption is never easy, but it's through acts of courage and humility that we find true healing. If this story touched you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tales of the Soldier for more inspiring stories. Your support helps us continue honoring the heroes who shaped our world. Thank you for being part of this journey.